Doctors of Reddit, what made you say how are you still alive? Pathologist here. Had a guy who had died suddenly and unexpectedly. I soon learned he was the recipient of a lung transplant about 15 years prior. When I opened the man up, his transplanted lung was upside down. I flipped the lung into the proper position, and bloop. It flipped right back to upside down. That was quite alarming. The surgeons who originally performed the transplant incorrectly attached the organ. When he by chance entered the correct position, the lung flipped over, causing his pulmonary artery to seal shut, resulting in his death. The man lived for 15 years with a lung that was dying to flip upside down. And it was only by sheer chance he didn't move in such a way that allowed it to do so until the fateful day of his death. It is one of the most fascinating cases I have ever witnessed. A patient I took care of had a car fall on his face. He was underneath it working when it slid off of the jack. The only reason he survived was because he broke every bone in his face. He had a Lafert 3, which allowed for his brain to swell. He also needed an additional surgery to relieve the pressure of cerebral edema, but the facial fractures did allow for a great deal of give in his skull. I was rotating through ICU, so I first saw him just a day after the accident. His head was so swollen, he didn't even look human. Fast forward a few weeks later, I was rotating through a different unit in the hospital and came across the same patient. He was quickly recovering and had minimal neuro deficits. Guy had an argument with his girlfriend, wanted to leave the apartment. Instead of taking the door, was real angry and jumped off the balcony. Fell down 40 feet directly on his heels on cement. He ended up having an ankle sprain. I wondered how he managed previous issues in his life. As a very junior doctor, I looked after this mega alcoholic who needed ascites, fluid in the abdomen caused by liver failure, tapping out every month or so. He kept coming in a worse and worse shade of yellow-green, jaundice, needing more and more fluid removed, still merrily drinking all the while. Well, the obvious happened. He died. Now he dead. So I wander onto the ward a few weeks later to find him sitting there in bed, green as you like, looking very alive. Turned out it was his twin, also an alcoholic, also not to live much longer. About 20 years ago, I had a patient come in with obstruction of his colon by a large colon cancer. The cancer had spread to his liver, and CT scan showed the liver basically replaced by metastatic tumor. So he wouldn't die on intestinal obstruction. I won't go into detail, but trust me, it is a very unpleasant way to die. The patient, his family, and I decided to try placing an expandable metal stent through the tumor. It worked. His obstruction was relieved and he was able to go home to spend his last days with his family. 18 months later, the patient came in for an office visit. For heartburn. He was even more jaundiced than when I first met him, but he felt basically well and was eating well. The stent was still functioning. I never saw him again and assumed he finally succumbed to his disease, but he got at least 18 months of precious and really good time. Patient stabbed himself in the neck with a thermometer that pierced his trachea. Missed all the important arteries, carotids, vertebrals, just hit some minor nerves. Good guy. Patient provided his own temperature reads until they removed the thermometer. Guy comes in with a bit of chest pain. Tells me the big C-right artery on the front of the heart was 100% blocked. I tell him, who told you that? He says his doctor did about 10 years ago. I don't believe him since patients never ever get any of the stuff their doctor tells them, right? I let the cardiac surgeon know what this guy said and he too goes haha 100%, so he's dead. If the biggest C-right artery is totally occluded and for 10 years no less, you are a dead man. Lo and behold, we get an angiogram and it was freaking 100% occluded. The artery on the back of the heart made a connection with the front of the heart to pick up the slack. It was some lucky shoot. I used to work as a clerk in diagnostic imaging at a hospital, and we had a man come in for an x-ray complaining of chest pain. His records showed his last visit was 2 years prior when he got drunk and fell into a fish tank, breaking it. ER stitched him up and sent him home. Fast forward 2 years, and we are all gathered around the computer screen looking at an x-ray that showed a 12-inch long piece of fish tank glass sitting in his chest, with his aorta resting right on top of it. It was on an angle running from his left shoulder down towards his right hip. There were other shards of glass too, but this one was the biggest. Emergency surgery happened right away. I had a guy with a Bowie knife sticking out of his chest. The knife was pulsating. I could literally count his pulse from across the room. Not a doctor, but I'm a nurse and my story is good too. I had a college student come into the unit on the night of their 19th birthday. They wanted to party, but had a test the next morning. One of their friends told them that if they took one Adderall for every drink that they had, they'd be sober by the morning. They had 15 shots and 15 20mg Adderall tablets. If you were wondering, no, that does not make you sober. It does, however, make you rip off all your clothes in a hallway, spit at the nurse that is trying to help you, shoot all over everything, and then literally freaking die. Luckily for them, they weren't dead for good. We got them back and they spent most of their sophomore year of college in a hospital, with a hole in their neck, learning how to walk again. I have thought that after seeing some CT scans of lungs in severe COPD, it's like there is no normal lung tissue, just huge air pockets. It is hard to see how they exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide at all. Not a doctor, but encountered a woman that was shot blank in the head by her boyfriend. Bullet entered one of her eye sockets and exited above her and ear on the same side. She called 911 on her own and survived, was in ICU 4 weeks, and testified against the bastard who is now thankfully in prison. Hemoglobin of 35, 3.5. In a 35-year-old guy with a chronic rectal bleed he refused to have looked into 4 months, because he didn't want anyone looking at his bumhole. Finally brought to the ER by ambulance when he fainted aka started dying, in a grocery store. Nurse here. 50-year-old male came to the ER after falling and not being able to get up. His testicles were so engorged they came down to his knees with a width circa 1.5x greater than his thigh. Peanuts was completely retracted into his scrotum. Had a CT scan that showed his entire large intestine, most of his small intestine, and his pancreas had herniated into his scrotum. You could auscultate his bowel sounds through his balls. The surgeon said she had never seen anything like this and that it takes months to get that way, and only happens in third world countries with poor/no access to medical care. She couldn't do much, because his diaphragm had become so accustomed to the altered space in his abdomen, that if she put his organs back in his abdominal cavity he wouldn't be able to breathe independently, would need to be ventilated permanently. Full stop. The poor guy had mental health issues, I believe schizophrenia, which is why he was in the condition he was in. He was still able to pee all by himself. Not a doctor, but I work in cardiology, and my doctors all do rotations at our hospital. Our hospital is a level 5 trauma and it's the closest hospital to a lot of rural area, so a lot of traumas that happen way out in the middle of nowhere end up at that hospital. This guy came in having been in a car accident. He was covered in road rash and his chest was more or less torn open. Apparently, as we all later learned, he'd been drinking and riding passenger in his friend's car. He wanted out of the car. His friend said no, so this guy, once again, very drunk, decided to try and jump out of the car window. He somewhat succeeded, but his shirt caught on the side view mirror and he got dragged until the driver stopped flipping out enough to come to his senses and stop. My dad's a doctor, so I asked him. When he was an intern in the ER, someone walked in the front door with a kitchen knife sticking out between his eyes to the handle. The knife went through his sinus cavity and ended with the tip in his throat, millimeters from his brainstem. He goes into surgery and walks out of the ICU the next day. My dad says he is the luckiest man he ever saw. Presented after crashing his truck in the hospital parking lot. He was there for a wound care appointment when his legs suddenly went numb and limp. Found to have acute aortic occlusion and bilateral saddle pulmonary emboli. Survived an aortic bypass and is still alive. Or, presented with abdominal pain, walked into the ED with a pH of 6.9, lactate of 24 and acute renal failure from metformin toxicity. He got a dialysis catheter placed and some idiot left the wire in, nobody realized that. Got dialyzed through the line and coded in dialysis. Resuscitated. They discovered the wire in his heart on the post-code chest x-ray. Transferred to us for removal of the wire in IR. Walked out 5 days later. Or, woman had lots of kids, had terrible placenta prurita and was told she would die if she had another kid. Didn't believe that, so she decided to have another kid. Had to have a cesarean hysterectomy, during which he bled so much he got transfused 150 units and had to be transferred in the middle of the case from one or to a different or that had an angiography suite in it so they could try to embolize the bleeding vessels. Went to the ICU with an open abdomen and clamps still on her vessels. Had several more stages procedures to get hemostasis and eventually close her abdomen. So technically she was right about the whole not dying thing. Also not a doctor, but my very elderly great uncle just had a Shrextuple heart bypass. Had 4 prior heart attacks. How he was still functioning somewhat normally before his last heart attack I honestly don't know. Had a patient coming confused and delirious because his kidneys were shutting down. He had multiple myeloma and a history of colon cancer plus a bunch of other things. He was jaundiced and needed to be shocked several times. The physicians, residents, and even the family thought he was going to die. The man insisted on full measures to keep him alive. He recovered in the span of 5 days. His kidneys improved, his delirium evaporated, and the man fricking walked out of the ICU. Then there was the guy who had to be castrated, but that's another story.